Hello and welcome to Rappler Talk. Today we'll be talking to Dr. Dennis Yu of the APEC Policy Support Unit. It's the research arm of the ongoing APEC Regional Economic Forum. Sorry, there are meetings now ongoing in Vietnam where our leaders, including President Duterte, President Trump, and other leaders in the Pacific Rim countries are going to meet for series of discussions on global issues and um, regional issues as well. Welcome to Rappler Talk, Dr. Dennis Yu.
Thank you.
Can you give us a update on what's happening there already? Because I understand that the week-long meetings have already started.
That's right. We're still in the middle of the what we call the APEC Economic Leaders Week. The ministerial meeting will begin today, this morning, and we just finished 2 days of the senior officials meeting. So there are a couple of key deliverables that we'll be hoping to get endorsed by APEC ministers and subsequently by the APEC leaders in a few days later. Of course, as we know, APEC is a economic and trade forum, and one of the key focus is to promote greater regional economic integration and trade integration in the region. We have a long-term goal for APEC, which is we call the Free Trade Area for the Asia Pacific, FTAP for short.
Yes.
There was a study that was completed last year, and right now they're trying to work out the action programs and initiatives, and some this action plans will be currently being discussed and hopefully to be agreed by all the ministers to take the FTAP initiative forward. But it's a long-term goal. So right now we're just looking at the building blocks, what needs to be done in trying to eventually, in the near future, to be in a position that when they're ready to negotiate. But right now, I think it's just a lot of it will be capacity building and also a lot of research, further research to see what can be done. I think another important area is on inclusion. Over the last couple of years, APEC has been hosted by developing economies, and I think there's been an increased focus on issues related to greater inclusion, economic inclusion, financial inclusion, as well as social inclusion. So there is an action agenda that's been put forward in the Vietnam year in trying to see what can be done in promoting greater financial, economic, and social inclusion in the Asia Pacific region. And again, that's another important initiative that they will be trying to see whether they can get that endorsed and to take that forward in next year. Digital economy, the internet and digital economy is really a very hot topic. We know that there's increased opportunities arising from the internet and digital economy. There's been this whole year, the APEC officials and experts have been working towards coming up with a roadmap to take this forward so that we can provide initiatives and measures that will particularly support micro, small, medium enterprises in taking advantage of digital technology so that they can be better plugged into the global value chain. So these are some of the key deliverables that we're looking forward to this week.
A lot of building blocks indeed. And a lot of these topics that you've mentioned have also been discussed in previous meetings of APEC and even at the ASEAN, which will be happening in Manila next week actually. But let me just go now to a report that that you have actually launched. Can you tell us more about it?
Sure. So the APEC Regional Trends Analysis Report
Yes.
Comes out twice a year. There's the one issue that came out normally during the trade ministers meeting in the middle of the year in May, what we call the ministers responsible for trade meeting, and then for this week for the APEC ministers meeting and for the leaders meeting. So we tend to look at to see what is the economic outlook for the APEC region and to see how that would have an impact on the work that many of the APEC working groups and committees are doing. And I think we can see that there's definitely a stronger economic turnaround this year compared to previous years. We know that since the global financial crisis in 2008, growth in the global economy has been quite sluggish. And certainly, if we look at trade performance in terms of exports and imports, we see that there's been even contractions in terms of imports and exports. But from the beginning of this year, we're beginning to see very, very strong improvements, particularly in trade performance. Overall, we see that the APEC region will grow by 3.9% in 2017, and that's significantly higher than the world economic growth, which I believe the IMF is forecast around 3.6%. And then for 2018, we're looking at a 3.8% growth in the APEC region. So again, we're beginning to outpace economic growth in the world, and we're seeing a lot of pickup particularly in trade performance in many of the APEC economies, including the Philippines. I think the Philippines and Vietnam, which is hosting APEC this year, has shown very strong economic growth. Particularly, we look at the quarterly numbers from the beginning of this year. So all in all, we're seeing great improvements. And in terms of drivers of growth, private consumption has always been keeping the economy going in many of the APEC economies in the region. But as I mentioned, we're seeing that pick up both in exports and imports, and that's basically providing that extra boost in growth in the APEC region. So we are expecting quite optimistic economic outlook for the next 2 years. Let me also focus a little bit on our theme chapter for the report, where we are looking at declining labor shares in the GDP. I think that's an important topic that's important to look at.
Which is actually
labor is a
yeah,
I'm sorry?
which is one of the indicators of inclusion, economic inclusion in the countries that are part of APEC.
That's right. And you would expect that with increase in productivity, that in many of the economies, the benefits of increase in productivity is reflected in rising wages. But we don't see that. We're beginning to see that's been happening for some time now, particularly in industrialized economies where wages have been either stagnant or declining, or in a declining trend. But we're also beginning to see that also happening in developing economies. Now, what's causing that? There's a lot of studies that's going on right now, and we are also beginning to look into it. It's quite complex, but it kind of boils down to two key issues. One is technological change. We're seeing all these new technologies and disruptors, as you call them, that's changing the way business is being done. But it's also replacing a lot of workers in factories and in other industries, where particularly when work is repetitive. So that's created a lot of job losses, particularly in advanced economies. In fact, that's one of the main reasons you're seeing that significant job losses. It's more to do with technology rather than free trade agreements. The other major cause is globalization. Globalization is good. We've seen the benefits coming from globalization, but we can't ignore the fact that globalization has also led to a number of job losses, partly due to outsourcing of production activities to other less developed countries where wages are lower. But so these two things in a way are interconnected to each other. So I think over the longer term, one of the main concerns is that with the rise of new technologies, it may lead to what we call structural unemployment, long-term unemployment, and a mismatch between skills, what the industries wants in terms of skills and what colleges and universities and technical institutions are providing. So I think there's a lot of soul searching that's going on right now to see what policymakers can do in terms of rethinking their education and policies, and to see whether the need to rethink the kind of university and technical education curriculum that's out there, so that we can be able to find greater convergence between what industry needs and what the universities are churning out in terms of their graduates. So these are one or two areas that we're beginning to look at.
Those are actually issues that we've been also trying to grapple with, because one of the legs of our growth is the BPO, or the business process outsourcing sector, and that's going to be hit by, as you mentioned, the industrial ITs and other new technologies that are coming in. So we're also trying to know how we're also trying to understand how we can navigate it and prepare our existing workforce to upskill themselves, um, increase their skill level to be prepared for the coming fourth revolution or the ongoing fourth revolution, as we say now. But indeed, as we mentioned a while ago, this labor participation in the growth area in the Pacific Rim countries has been a long-term issue. So already, for this particular week-long summit in Vietnam now, what do you think will be a new input by the different representatives of the countries to these issues?
Well, we have to wait and see. I mean, we've got a lot of reports that's come out this year focusing on human capital development that covers labor participation, and I think they need to think it over. We have the APEC economic policy report, which comes out once a year. It looks at different economic issues, and this year looks at structural reforms and human capital development. Again, it addresses these concerns of skills mismatching and how do we uh, help greater labor participation, particularly in some of the new and growing sectors. So I think as they mull over the reports this year, they will be able to see how they can translate that into clear and concrete policy initiatives as we move forward. So what's important to know is that in APEC, there's increased focus on continuity. So there may be a major initiative that's been launched this year, but it needs to be carried forward in subsequent year. Um, we know, for example, during the Philippines year, one of the major deliverables when the APEC was hosted in the Philippines was the Boracay Action Agenda to support micro, small, medium enterprises.
Yes.
And again, that's a major initiative that continues to move forward every year. Uh, Supporting micro, small, medium enterprises is a key issue if you want to look at inclusion. Most of the businesses across the APEC, Asia Pacific region are small, medium-sized businesses. And so what can we do and what can policymakers do to create a kind of business-friendly environment to support them? That includes, of course, capacity building, building up expertise. That includes building expertise in digital technology. How can we help them in terms of upgrading their skills so that they can better participate in these global value chains?
Yes, APEC has been very focused on MSMEs, particularly for its job generating abilities. But let me just go now to one of the key issues that that's being mentioned when APEC is where APEC is concerned. They say that we're facing a new world order where there's less focus on the West and more toward ASEAN, China, and Japan. You'll have Mr. Trump, Mr. President Duterte at the summit. What do you expect when these world leaders come together?
I don't know much about the new world order, but certainly what we're expecting when all these world leaders are coming for APEC meeting is to find common ground, in promoting greater trade liberalization, trying to promote greater regional economic integration and prosperity for the region. So I think that's I think we find APEC is a unique platform for that. It's not a binding institution. It's basically a forum where we can talk about new issues and emerging challenges, such as, for example, digital technologies, and to see whether there's a common ground in all APEC economies to come together, whether you're an advanced economy like the US or a developing one, such as Papua New Guinea. So to find common grounds in which they can help each other is what I think APEC is good for, particularly in trying to reach out to each other. So I think that's how I see this week playing out.
Okay, talking of finding a common ground, TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, how is that coming along considering the US has decided not to participate in it and RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Program, is supposed to be already completed by the end of the year or at least it is 2017. How are those coming along?
Okay, RCEP and TPP are outside the APEC process, but we do recognize that both these regional trade agreements are what we call pathways or building blocks towards APEC's own initiative for the free trade area for the Asia Pacific. As far as you know, for RCEP, which is driven by ASEAN, as we know, it's still going on. I think they will still continue. I don't believe it can be completed in terms of negotiations this year, and I think they will continue to move forward next year and hopefully try to reach some completion. But we don't know right now certainly when that be. TPP itself, we know there was a major setback earlier this year. The US has pulled out of TPP. So the remaining 11 members of TPP, which are APEC economies, are trying to find a way to take this forward. The TPP itself is what we consider a high quality next generation free trade agreement touching on many issues such as digital trade and IPRs. So they're trying to find a way to move forward without the US. And the trade ministers for TPP, I believe, will be meeting in the sidelines this week to see whether they can come up with some agreement to take this forward. So we have to wait and see.
As well as with the RCEP and the FTAP.
FTAP itself will be a longer term goal, but I think what we're focusing on is the action plan. How do we take this forward with a series of initiatives, and that's currently being discussed this week.
There will be elephants in the room when the leaders come together. In particular, North Korea, China's decision to focus on quality growth rather than fast growth. May I know your thoughts about how those may play out when the leaders come together?
Okay, with North Korea, I don't think it will be discussed because APEC itself is an economic and trade forum, so we really talk about trade and economics. So there will be no discussions with regards to security. With other issues, I'm sorry, what was the other point?
China. Because you mentioned a
Right.
while ago that in your current report, you're looking at 3.9% growth for 2017 and the APEC economies. But China is already saying that no, will not go for the usual 10% or 8% annual growth that we've been used to for the past decades. We'll go for quality growth because we want inclusiveness. But that kind of have an impact on ripple effect on other economies which depend on China for trade, for other issues. So I just want to know your inputs on that.
Okay, this is not new. I mean, the Chinese authorities have been saying for quite a few years now that they need to make that transition from previously an export-driven and investment-driven economy to a much more balanced economy with greater support particularly in private consumption. So they're making that transition, which is quite natural as an economy develops. But it does mean that they can't grow at 10% every year, and they're not. I mean, we can see for the last couple of years now that they're making that transition, and the economy is growing roughly between 6 to 7%, I think. But looking at this first half of this year's numbers from China, the economic growth numbers are quite strong. I think it's about 6.9%. They're making that transition. And as they strengthen their domestic economy and lead to greater private consumption, it also means that it would also have an impact on the region. There'll be growing middle class, and maybe it's not a static model. So we're not just exporting parts and components to China, and that's being assembled for other markets, but that we're also looking at other things, particularly the services sector. As a growing middle class in China will demand more sophisticated products, consumer products, and other types of services. And that would mean that it will create new business opportunities for the region. So essentially what we need to do is to be dynamic and to be able to shift our focus on different types of growth areas to support a growing middle class in China.
Which will have an impact as well to neighboring countries like ourselves, because our government decided to do some rebalancing and focus more on our trade and diplomatic relationship with China rather than other existing ones, let's say the US and Europe. Um, I'm just focusing on China because of possible impact as well on our growth and our trade. Um, where does that lead China-dependent countries like ourselves um, moving forward in terms of, as I mentioned, trade and other things? Um, I ask that because moving forward, um, when you have a I mean, China being the next superpower or the upcoming one, um, how do economies like ourselves uh, pivot now in terms of moving forward? How do we is it better for us to to start looking at China for more trade, for more services, for more products, etc., rather than now we're very US and Europe centered? And how gradual should that transition be? Because we've seen how it was like when trade barriers are brought down almost immediately, like what we've done. Um, that the shift has been very difficult for some of our industries, and what we've learned so far is that it's better to do it gradually rather than uh, at one at one go. So um, with China and Japan, well, China in particular being a major player now, how should countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, and others in ASEAN, developing economies, move forward?
Okay. Well, yeah, many questions, but I think if you're focusing on China, I think we're seeing a quite a significant turnaround in terms of economic outlook, not just for China, but we're also seeing that in the U.S. and also in Europe. So those engines of growth is no longer just China, but we begin to see that coming back in the U.S. and in Europe. So I think in many ways, the focus should not just be on one big growth area, country, but in several. So I think a much more balanced approach towards economic and trade policy will be quite crucial. You mentioned ASEAN. The other great focus within ASEAN members, of course, Philippines is a member and you're chairing ASEAN this year, is to support greater economic integration to achieve the ASEAN economic community. Um, it potentially is a huge market and a magnet for foreign direct investments in the region. So in a way, for ASEAN and Philippines as a member, is greater emphasis in trying to achieve and realize the ASEAN economic community will be quite crucial for Philippines and all ASEANs in terms of their economic sustainability and development. So it's not just China. I think that there's also a greater focus on looking at the AEC.
AEC, and so all of these things are happening at once. So you're saying that we shouldn't just focus on one superpower or two or three, but continue dealing with as much as possible all the opportunities out there.
That's right.
Okay, so this week is APEC, next week is ASEAN. We're being treated to a parade of sorts of world leaders in, in this part of the world. Um, do you consider this as just that, a parade of world leaders, or do you think that there's something substantive is coming out when these leaders come together and talk about not just economic but other issues of you know um, world order, as I mentioned a while ago? What do you think will they come up with as far as APEC is concerned?
Well, as I mentioned, every year APEC has a number of key priorities that they want to focus on. So I think the leaders I mean, they don't work in separation. There's a lot of work that's been going on throughout the year by working groups and committees to support the APEC host economy and their priorities. So the leaders would be highlighting that, and particularly in a much more strategic way, some of these priorities. We talked about closer regional economic integration. That's one. Looking at greater inclusion, economic, financial, and social inclusion. How to greater promote digital and the internet and digital economy. These are some of the key things I'm looking at. So I think these are some of the areas. I've
Okay.
been sending little messages here that we're about to start the ministerial meeting, so
Okay.
I'm afraid I may need to stop here. My apologies.
Yeah, sure, no problem. But thank you for gracing us with your presence, and good luck on the ongoing economic leaders meeting in Vietnam.
Thank you very much.
There you have it. Thank you for joining us in Rappler Talk. See you next time.